Joining us from Los Angeles to talk about the coverage of international news in the United States is political commentator Cenk Uygur. He's the CEO and founder of the Young Turks network and host of its flagship online program. And David Ensor is an award-winning journalist and former diplomat. He also served as the director of the Voice of America. He currently heads the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University, right here in Washington. Thanks to both of you for joining us. David, let me start with you. We just heard Salome Anderson there tell us about her frustration about what she says is the lack of interest in international news in the United States. She used to be a foreign correspondent, freelance in the Middle East. She's back now in the United States. She says the market's changed. You've been a correspondent, a foreign correspondent for a long time. Has the market changed?
It has. The way in which we receive news is changing all the time, and that has both good and bad effects, and it's sort of in process, right? When I became a television correspondent, I wanted to cover foreign news. I wanted to help explain the world around us to Americans because I felt that it was so important in a democracy for the voters to know as much as possible about not only their country but the world around it. And you know, part of the reason I did that is because back then even, there was a bit of a problem. This country has got two very friendly neighbors and oceans on the other two sides. It has a tendency to be rather sort of self-sufficient, and people go about their lives, and many of them rather ignore the rest of the world. They can afford to, they feel. That's not true anymore, of course. And we need a better educated electorate here in the United States. It's a project that I think everyone needs to think about and work on. But that said, to be blunt, I'll put a voting public over a authoritarian government anytime.
Cenk, what is your view on coverage of international issues in the United States? And I'm not just talking about foreign news here as in stories that are completely alien to the United States, because much of what is happening in the world involves the United States, like the onslaught we see in Yemen. Those weapons that Saudi Arabia is using, those are American weapons. We see the conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis. It does concern the United States. The conflict in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan. But it seems to be off the radar right now.
Yes. So, well, there's good news, bad news here. Let me start with a small amount of good news, and then I'll move on to the overwhelming bad news. The good news is that right now there are outlets like YouTube, Facebook, and all the other online presence that are far more international. So nearly 50% of our audience on YouTube, for example, is international, and they demand international news on giant stories like the conflict right now in the Gaza Strip. So I think that that is changing the landscape of American media, but that is a nascent movement. Now let's move on to the hugely bad news. There's two reasons why America doesn't concentrate on international news. One is it's inconvenient. All we do is start wars. Unfortunately, we become the bad guys in a lot of parts of the world. I mean, what we're doing in Yemen is horrific. The fact that we're not helping the Muslims and Rohingya Muslims in Southeast Asia is unconscionable, let alone our universal support for the occupation in Israel. So the propaganda in America and the military-industrial complex and the cable news that supports it is not interested in that story. And the second giant problem is tribalism. And unfortunately, the right wing has been in charge, not just physically and literally, but ideologically for the last 4 decades here in America. And they support the idea that the only people that matter are Americans and everyone else is scary others. And so with that kind of mindset dominating here, it's unsurprising that we care less about the rest of the world.
David, that's an interesting point. Who sets the foreign news agenda? Is it foreign news organizations or is it the State Department? Should, for instance, foreign news organizations in the United States start covering the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar more extensively? Would that suddenly get the government to say, well, there's something going on here, we need to look at this?
Maybe. I would see no harm in there being more reporting of that. It's a tragedy. But Cenk just said that, that the right-wing establishment has been in charge of American foreign policy for 40 years, and I'm wondering about Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and a few other people I don't identify as being on the right of American foreign policy. So I'm not quite sure what your point is.
They definitely are. Yes.
Barack Obama.
So did Barack Obama get us out of Afghanistan? No, he doubled down on Afghanistan. No matter what happens, the military-industrial complex is still in charge. What did Bill Clinton do? He did further bombings which then led to further wars and further terrorism. So they might call themselves Democrats, they might even pretend from time to time to be progressives, but they are no such thing. They are totally establishment politicians that have gone along with the right-wing ideology of the establishment.
Okay, I want to get back to media coverage.
I totally disagree.
Okay. David, we've heard of this term parachute reporting. This is where correspondents fly into a disaster zone, cover it, and then leave. We don't have the continuous coverage of countries where these disasters take place. The reality of the situation is that we have to ask ourselves, can news organizations afford to have bureaus in Africa, in South America, in Central America?
It's a real question. When I joined ABC News, it had between 10 and 15 foreign bureaus. Now it's down to 1 or 2, and that's obviously a bad trend. Part of the reason, though, is that, of course, the audience has been has moved in other directions. As Cenk said, much of it is now online, and people are consuming their news in so many different ways. So the budgets for the big networks and the big newspapers are not what they once were for foreign coverage, and that is a problem, which I think we all need to think about and work on. I'd like to see more foreign bureaus, and I'd like to see more coverage of the world around us. I think it's good in a democracy for people to know more about the world around them, but the big news organizations don't have the budgets they used to have. That's one of the problems.
Cenk, to what extent is the problem the fact that much of the American media has become heavily corporatized? They're now part of huge corporations. They're not seen as independent news organizations, but rather as a revenue stream in a big corporation. And that revenue stream is competing with other parts of the corporation to bring in money to make sure the share price keeps heading north.
That's exactly right. And I think there are two phenomena here. One is that news used to be a public service, and in order to get the public airwaves in America, those corporations made a deal that they would do news. And then they forgot about that conveniently, and they wanted news to be a profit center, and so then it became infotainment. And then that's why you have the foreign bureaus being shut down, because it's not profitable. The second part of the problem is that, look, the corporate media has an agenda. And when people say that, they get really touchy about it. But get real. So when you talk about Russia today being controlled by the Russian government, that's true. I think from time to time they do okay journalism. I know some good folks on there. I think Al Jazeera does some great journalism from time to time, but they are controlled by the government of Qatar. Those are all things that are true. But CNN is controlled by Time Warner. MSNBC is controlled by Comcast. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations, and these corporations have become almost the new nation states. They too have an agenda. Part of their agenda is to maintain the establishment, because right now they're on top. If you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation, why would you want to rock the boat? It's your boat. So their massive bias is in favor of the status quo. And in order to maintain the status quo, they do things like encourage money in politics, because that money flows into television and advertising. And so all of that leads to news being a profit center and not being for the public interest.
Yeah, I agree. I was, for a while, I ran up communications at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan. And as an old television correspondent, I watched the coverage. And it bothered me that if it bleeds, it leads was so much what drove, with the philosophy that drove the coverage on the evening news, and often drove the coverage even in the major newspapers. Bad news was good news, or bad news was useful news. Good news wasn't even reported in many cases. So that's a problem, and I think we have structural issues there. I kind of wish there was a BBC and other publicly funded broadcasters of size in the United States. It's a problem we have here, no question about that.
As journalists, are we being a little bit too idealistic when we think of news organizations having some kind of social duty to provide the news, to have these foreign bureaus, when after all what they are business organizations? At its core, what these news organizations in the United States do is provide opportunities for advertisers, don't they?
That's right. Many of them are for-profit organizations. Right. I ran Voice of America for 4 years. That was not a for-profit organization. So if I decided that it was, or if my journalists decided that it was news that there were 50 new maternal health clinics opening in Afghanistan, that could be the lead story possibly on the Afghan service broadcasts, and not necessarily that a bomb had killed 2 soldiers that afternoon, which would have been probably the lead on a commercial station.
So I just got to add to that, because it's really important. Let me buttress that point and then give you some good news. Maz Jobrani's a great comedian. He's on the Young Turks from time to time, and he makes a point about when he goes to perform in Iran, he can't make jokes about Allah or Muhammad, and people say, well, that's censorship. But when he comes here and does a Comedy Central special, he's not allowed to make jokes about advertisers. So corporate sponsors are our God, our Allah. So we've got to be cognizant of the different biases that are inherent that we don't recognize in America. But the good news is that a lot of the news organizations, including our own, are switching to a subscription model. So it's not that we don't take advertisers, and Young Turks is for profit as well, but we rely more heavily on our viewers to be subscribers to our channel. As the New York Times used to be 2/3 advertising revenue, 1/3 subscription revenue. They've now flipped. It's now 2/3 subscription revenue and only 1/3 advertisers. And by the way, their journalism now is far more hard-hitting, and I would argue it's because the financial model has changed.
Very quickly, David, does that model need to change? Is there opportunity for people like Cenk to provide a subscriber-based news service rather than one that relies on advertising?
There is, and I think it's a great trend. I think Cenk's right that is a good thing to see.
Yeah.
The trouble is, though, there's only 2 or 3 major newspapers left standing and doing that in a financially successful way in this country now. In 1980, there were probably 25 major newspapers in this, that were really successful in this country. So it remains to be seen whether the amount of journalism that should be done can be done on that basis. What we really have a dearth of in this country, and frankly I think you do in many other countries as well, is good local coverage, because so many papers have closed.
We're going to have to leave it there, gentlemen. Thanks to both of you for joining us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.